Do you need to try slides or anything? It looks like we're fine on that. Everything's set from your side. You don't need to.
No, I should be set to go. I do a lot of online
You're gotten pretty good at it. Yeah.
I think.
Perfect. All right, we'll give it a couple minutes since that's going. I'm gonna try and silence as many things as I can get my hands on for the moment.
Yeah, one of my good friends from my Air Force days, used to be with you guys. I don't know if Mike Wall was there before your time, or
I missed him. I've heard a ton about him, and I know he's up at Minnesota, or at least last I heard he was still at Minnesota. No, I've heard many good things about him, but never got to meet him. But yes, sounds like a good person. Well, Elahi was the one that came up to me today. It's the only one I saw today. So he's the one that wanted to make sure he said hi. I'm still waiting for him to come on. Hopefully he pops on at some point. Are you still logged in? Just in case there's feedback. Sometimes there's feedback if we have two in the same room.
So I
Okay. Hopefully it should be all right.
Yeah, I think Justin and I have done that to each other. Our offices are across the hallway, so
Get that feedback just a, it's trying to shoot it down early on. All right, well, it's 5:30. People tend to just stop popping in right now. So how about we just get going? I'll give you, that way you have as much time to talk as fast as you want and do what you want to do. So I'll just give the quick intro. So I know people are still coming on, but thank you again for showing up for our trauma conference. If you are coming on, please make sure you mute yourself. We have a great pleasure today to welcome Tom Grissom from Shock Trauma. Oh, there you are. There's the feedback that we were looking for. So we're welcoming Tom Grissom from Shock Trauma today. Dr. Grissom is kind enough to talk to us about recent papers that should change our practice. Dr. Grissom has an extensive career in civilian and military medicine. He's an anesthesiologist at Shock Trauma, has worked extensively with C-STARS and CCATs. It sounded like you actually helped with developing some of these. Is that true?
Yeah, we started while it was down at Wilford Hall with the Air Force, and actually was served as the first course director for the critical care transport team training program.
Well, it's something that I know we're very familiar with here now that we have our C-STARS, that seems to be growing by the month, which is wonderful. And we keep hearing rumors of a CCAT unit coming close by. So definitely something near and dear to our hearts, but I just want to thank you for coming on. And with that, the forum is yours. And, if at the end, if people have questions, feel free to raise your hand or put it in the chat, and we'll try and get it to as many of them as we can. But with that, let's get going.
Okay, well, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. If you guys can just confirm that you can see me on there.
We can see you
up there, Justin.
We can see you, Tom.
Well, great, everybody, welcome. Like Justin said, I did 29 years with the Air Force, counting my time back at the Air Force Academy and the Uniformed Services University, the military's medical school in Bethesda, Maryland, followed by 21 years on active duty, and finished up those last 4 years actually at the R. Adams Cowley Shock Trauma Center. Again, that was sort of running the C-STARS program there, the Center for the Sustainment of Trauma and Readiness Skills, something that those of y'all are there, and with the collaboration between the Air Force and the civilian practice that's been developing over the last, I guess going on about 20 years now. When I finished my time with the Air Force in 2007, it just kind of felt like the right place to be, to stay at Shock Trauma. My time in the military, again, for those with military experience know the people you've worked with are some of the best people you've ever had the opportunity to collaborate with. It's why I ended up staying there, where I've now been for a total of 19 years, counting the 4 years on active duty I spent there. One of the things that I really enjoy doing is kind of keeping up on what's going on in the literature out there, particularly now with respect to the management of the traumatically injured patient. I'm also an intensivist by training and spent a number of years in our neurotrauma ICU. So I also have a sort of an interest in the management of neurotrauma as well, and integrating, the new technologies, monitoring, et cetera, and how we can best serve the patients that we take care of in this environment. So this talk I've done before many times, but typically it's not focused on trauma. It really is looking at 10 papers that I kind of pick out over the course of a year, keep it constantly updating and changing to find things that I think may influence how we practice in the future. Now, it may not be a paper itself that has that great of an impact. It really brings that kind of evolve in the practice, as we all should be evolving over time. Again, with trauma, and this is one of those things, there's a lot of different ways that we encounter our patients, and there's a lot of things that go into their management. It's not just us in the operating room, so it's not just that intraoperative care that we deliver. We do have to interact with the surgeons. Their technology, their techniques, their way of approaching patient management has also continued to evolve, just like our practice has in resuscitation. And also, we do get patients from the field, right? So it's what's being done before they get to us that sometimes influences not only the outcomes, but how we teach patients as well. Just leave some questions in the chat as kind of a reminder. So when we get to the very end, we'll kind of come back and circle around and be able to kind of go through some of the things that cropped up that people had questions or thoughts on. And then again, hopefully we'll have a little bit of discussion at the end, but I can almost guarantee it's going to run over an hour by the time we get done. Just because I do really like, I got a number of them just from my own reading, but I also few of the other folks I work with who actually, are on the operating end of things, what they thought was going to change their practice, how they manage their patients. So really, this is a recent review of trauma-related articles that could have an impact on your practice. At the same time, we can talk a little bit about how we apply these different techniques, approaches, management philosophies, et cetera, to our patients, because not everything that we see out there that comes in. And this talk also gives me an opportunity to highlight one other thing: my toy collection. I've been collecting old military toys, civilian as well, that are medically themed and related. My grandmother, gave me some toy soldiers when I was a kid. Thought somebody should collect something. I ended up collecting toy soldiers. Grouping from a company called Britons, one of the most popular toy soldier makers in the world. Again, it's sort of their ambulance unit with not only the nurses, stretcher carriers, but also the corpsmen, et cetera, along with the vehicles. So as I go between talks, I'll pop up a slide with something else and give you a little background on one of the pieces of my collection. So we're going to start out with probably one of the most common things that we all see. I don't know about your practice, but probably every day we have somebody in the operating room has fallen and broken their hip. Now, that seems like a relatively minor trauma. We know that the outcomes and the impact of that injury alone are pretty significant. When you add up the broken hip by the numbers, as was done here by somebody, again, 95% of these are caused by falls. Our older patient population, which is increasing in numbers and significant comorbidities, is also prone to fall. Again, adults 65 and older who fall each year about. Fortunately, nothing was bruised but my ego. But again, hip fractures, again, also contribute to early mortality and other comorbidities. And believe it or not, the lawyers know this as well. Whenever I'm looking at surgical complications and such, it's inevitable that when I'm doing a suit, or me or anybody else, for that specific injury. And certainly broken hips in nursing homes really fall into that category. Now, hips fractures are very common. there's a couple of things we always think about, right? How fast do we get people in the operating room? What type of anesthetic we're going to do? What do we need to do in terms of timing and management for those patients? One of those issues, the timing, was actually addressed a couple of years ago and published in 2020, and that was the hip attack trial that many of y'all may be familiar with. This was one where the surgeons, we get this pushback from our ortho guys all the time, we got to fix that hip early. The earlier we fix it, the better the patient will do. And in fact, there speeding up that evaluation and workup that we frequently need in these older patients that we should say that we think we need in these older patients. And in this study, they actually managed to get in 6 hours, or they let it be standard of care, and with 6 hours essentially versus 24 hours. Interestingly enough, there was no difference in any outcomes between the two groups. Again, our surgeons have kind of backed off pushing us to get people in the OR, in 6 hours, but they still would like to do it within 24. The one group that actually showed a difference, again, not powered to be perfectly analyzed in this, was actually the interesting group, the patients with elevated troponins on admission. Probably the one group that we would all typically now want to have the cardiologist see, get clearance, make sure they're doing well. Turns out if you didn't actually do that, they did better in the OR within that 6 hour period. They ultimately did better, suggesting perhaps that some of this troponin elevation was just, again, sort of the blood pressure, heart rate thing, pain, et cetera. And that if you got them in, fixed that, mobilized them, they actually were less likely to go on and have some of the complications associated with delay. So now there's actually a second trial that's actually in process. We'll see this out pretty soon. And that's the hip attack 2, specifically targeting those patients with troponin elevations. What I really wanted to talk about was not so much that, but the type of anesthetic we do, because it always comes down to that big discussion, right? Is it going to be a regional anesthetic? I think this is probably one that has had swings in one direction or the other in terms of what people believe is the best way to approach these patients. The most recent trial actually took a slightly different approach, and this is one that was published just late last year, the REGAIN trial. It's regional versus general anesthesia for promoting independence after hip fracture. It was a pragmatic, randomized superiority trial, so looking to prove that one technique or the other was better than the other alternative. For patients over the age of 50, was done in 46 US and Canadian hospitals. The primary outcome wasn't just that big, D, the death that we look for, mortality. They also incorporated into that primary outcome an inability to walk 10 feet independently or within a cane walker of 60 days, assuming you could walk independently in one of those methods prior to your fall or your injury that caused the hip fracture. So again, not just death, but looking at functional outcomes, something that I think we're starting to see more and more in many of the trials that are being accomplished. And with this particular trial, they randomized a large number of patients, 1,600, which is pretty good and much larger than most of the other trials that have been published. Again, it was about 50-50 between the spinal anesthetic group and those in the general anesthesia group. Ultimately, the big outcome, death or inability to walk, no difference between the two groups. It was 18.5% versus 18% between the two alternative anesthetic techniques. Now, when you look at the actual numbers themselves, again, if you look at it here, the p-value was completely non-significant. Just grossly looking at it, it's hard to believe that there could be a difference with that sort of outcomes. When you look at the secondary outcomes, looking at just death or inability to walk, and also they threw in their delirium. One of the other hot topics nowadays is this postoperative cognitive decline, and what we may be doing in the operating room that actually contributes to new onset delirium in the postoperative period or decreases in some form of cognitive function. So they threw that in there as another secondary outcome. Turns out none of those were statistically significant either by themselves. The only thing I thought was kind of interesting, if you look at the median time for randomization to discharge, it was actually longer in Canada, although it is not statistically significantly different. Again, perhaps suggesting there may have been some surgical techniques or overall general management schemes and endpoints for discharge. In the US, a lot of times we have access to rehab or sort of other hospitals that can continue the rehab process, which may not have been available in Canada. But again, still not statistically significant when you broke it down by those groups there. Now, when you compare this to prior work, I think the big things to note are that most of the previous studies really assessed differences in intraoperative events and in-hospital complications. They really weren't powered to test for differences in outcomes beyond hospital discharge. That's sort of what made this study a little bit more unique and a little bit stronger in its setup. Again, the primary outcome, in lower percentage of patients than predicted, may have played a little bit of this because it had reduced power relative to what they anticipated prior to starting the study. But again, it would have to be pretty significant difference to have made up for the fact that they were essentially the same outcomes. One of the things also, and this is again something I'm sure you guys experience as well, while you may cross over from spinal to GA, most people don't cross over going back the other direction. And there was a 15% crossover rate. And also, again, when you start thinking about delirium, there's also this concern about different sedation practices that may take place during the surgery. That was not standardized in this approach. So this concept of whether delirium was impacted by regional versus general, you have to remember many of these patients getting regional, they were also getting sedation, which could have played a part in the fact that there was no difference in that delirium outcome. Now, this is where I always love looking at a study. And that's at that consort diagram at the very beginning where they talk about how many patients they assessed, how many patients they ended up actually evaluating, and what were the reasons for excluding those patients? Because this is very important when you look at the results as well, I think. They considered 22,000 patients being assessed for eligibility. So these would be patients with hip fractures going to the operating room. When they actually ended up excluding them, they also went ahead and a priori said anybody who's on any form of anticoagulant or had a coagulopathy documented, since you couldn't offer the spinal, we're just going to exclude them from the analysis. So that's a pretty good chunk of patients right there. The second group that was actually pretty large also were those who had a preference for general or regional anesthesia. The patients who show up and say, I want to go to sleep, period. That's the end of the discussion. So again, when you look at these numbers, that was about 20% and 22% respectively of the overall patient population. And I kind of circled that one there about had physician who declined participation. Justin Richards, who frequently signs into this meeting as well from our institution, had this event happen just a couple weeks ago. Patient coming in for hip surgery, talked to patient, they settle on a spinal, got a spinal. Surgeon shows up and he's in absolute shock because we never do spinals here. And had a long discussion with Justin afterward about why a spinal was selected for that patient, why we didn't do general, et cetera. Again, probably too much for this discussion, but just be aware it's not just the patients, but many of our surgeon colleagues may also have a kind of built-in bias one way or the other. Now, again, I think what this does really in terms of our patient management issues for the future, the technique we choose for these patients, we typically like to think we're doing it based on outcomes. Well, if the outcome's no difference, then maybe really going with patient preference, you don't have to force that patient into a regional. If you don't think it's going to benefit them clearly for some other indication that's not present in this study. And again, with no difference in new onset delirium or hospital length of stay, it really comes down to you and your patients, in terms of deciding what you're comfortable doing, what they're comfortable having, and then again, proceeding with the best care that we can deliver, regardless of which technique is ultimately chosen, but with the understanding that it is very unlikely to affect your overall outcomes for that patient. All right, moving on to number 2 here. This is actually a toy soldier that we kind of fall into what we call the dime store categorization. These are figures that were made kind of between World War I and World War II. They're about so big, you can see my fingers there. Again, typically made out of lead, hollow cast, or in this case, solid iron. This is a little unusual in that it's a kind of what they call a duplex figure. You have both the nurse and the wounded patient. And you can even see a little bit of the rust on there, again, because it is made out of solid iron. So when we think about pre-hospital stuff, one of the things we've been told for many years is this thing about the golden hour. Now, most of us realize that's kind of a made up concept there. Certainly there are patients who would benefit by getting to hospital sooner than an hour. And there are certainly other patients that's not influenced on how long it takes to get to hospital, as long as it's done in a reasonably timely fashion. Now, this isn't the paper I want to talk about, but I pulled this graph out of a paper for an assessment that was done in Japan, looking at the golden hour. They looked at the log odds of mortality over time to definitive care from the point of injury, time of injury, to how long it took to get to the hospital where they could actually provide some definitive care. And as you can see, here's one graph on the left where it kind of goes up a little bit, and then that mortality kind of drops off. The one on the right-hand side, again, sort of has this flat curve and sort of seeing this increasing log odds of mortality. Now, if I were to ask you, which of those would actually be the graph for patients presenting with a systolic blood pressure less than 70, i.e. those presenting with severe shock, I would have intuitively said the one on the right. Because again, you don't expect people to get better over time or with longer transport times. Interestingly enough, it's actually the exact opposite. What they found in their study was, again, that those patients with severe shock, even if they got within 1 hour, not much difference in terms of outcomes, but if it took longer, it didn't necessarily influence the outcomes. Conversely, with moderate shock, so systolic blood pressure is greater than 70, still pretty significant shock, but not as bad as those on the left. The mortality, as you would expect, kind of goes up a little bit over time, the longer it takes to get to care. Now, there's a lot of issues with that particular trial in terms of whether or not it's related to a survival bias. So if you didn't make it to the hospital, again, you didn't figure in these numbers, whether hypotensive resuscitation or failure to resuscitate early on may actually ultimately improve outcome. There were a lot of little theories for this, but this was just an observation. The trial I picked out really looks at something else, which again, kind of gets this concept of the scoop and run versus sort of that stay and play philosophy that many of our EMS people talk about, on which patients need to be gotten to the hospital as fast as possible with or without any interventions, as long as you don't delay getting them there. In Denmark, they had their huge database, which had over 630,000 patients. 22,000 of them had an ISS of greater than 9. They only looked at those with ground transport. So again, where they could get a fairly significant range of transport times. You have to realize that unlike our system here, we're kind of missing that middle tier there. We do have ambulances staffed by various level of individuals with paramedic training. We also have helicopter-based teams, which typically have a little better experience on there, at least in terms of having paramedics, if not having a physician on board. And that kind of in between, this ground-based critical care team concept is really more of a European concept, and one that's employed in a number of different nations, where you may have someone, including possibly an anesthesiologist, on the ambulance, actually able to do some more advanced procedures, either at the scene or en route. But in this particular study, they didn't really break it out by the categories of who saw the patient, but they did look at a lot of the characteristics of the cohort, and then went back to look to see how much time spent on scene did it really influence ultimately the outcomes. Because again, time on scene is frequently interpreted as procedures being done, things being done to extract the patient, et cetera. And I'll blow this up a little bit so it's easier to see here. But the key thing is that when you look at their total times in Denmark, and again, they're not horribly excessive. In this country, we frequently have transport times in excess of an hour. There, it's pretty much always under an hour to get to the total hospital time, just due to shorter distances. But the on-scene time was almost double the transport time. So again, even though they had fairly short transport times, if you look, there's 12 to 14 minutes kind of across the spectrum there. Frequently, they would spend, 150% of that time, that they had in the transport, more than 50% of it actually on the scene, doing things to get the patient prepared to transport. And when you look at outcomes, again, the longer the scene time, again, is associated with odds of death increasing, both at 24 hours. And if you can see, if you spent more than 50 minutes on scene, you're getting up to a 80% odds increase. Again, pretty significant. Now, again, there's a lot of selection bias here. People who are entrapped, people with severe shock, where there may be a need or thought to do more procedures, certainly will have a longer on scene typically than those who have minimal minor injuries. And again, also that transport time may be a part of it as well. But then the on-scene time, again, even looking at odds of death within 30 days, it looks like that inflection point is about 10. Once you get up over about 20 minutes, you start to see an increase in the odds of death. Again, suggesting that perhaps that concepts that we've talked about here, scoop and run versus stay and play, are sort of out there. The whole concept of scoop and run has been expanded not just beyond EMS. This is actually from the Philadelphia Police Department, where they actually have a directive that allows police officers just to grab a patient with a penetrating injury, either knife or stab, and transport them directly to the hospital without waiting for the EMS to show up. Again, under the concept that the sooner you get to the hospital, the better you're going to do. I don't know what you guys have in St. Louis. We call it the Homie Express, but these are the ones where someone is shot, fairly close to the hospital, and one of his homies, one of his buddies, grabs him, takes him to the hospital, and drops him off in our emergency department, which unfortunately isn't our trauma resuscitation unit. So many of our trauma alerts that we get are actually patients being brought directly upstairs in the emergency department where they don't even manage a patient. They just put them on a stretcher and bring them straight up to shock trauma, which again, same building, one floor up and off to the left a little bit, versus the stay and play. And we're starting to see this more now because we do have some EMS physicians and individuals in emergency medicine training who kind of help manage our EMS system. Sometimes when they're on the scene, they start doing things like ultrasound, whipping out one of the butterflies, one of the small portable units. And again, the concept of doing more because you can doesn't necessarily obviously improve outcomes. Again, not one of the primary studies I was going to talk about here, but just incidentally, kind of ties into this. There was a recent Eastern Association for Surgery of Trauma multi-center trial that reported on what the impact of pre-hospital procedures was in penetrating trauma. So these are patients who have their gunshot wounds, stabs, et cetera, and whether or not they get procedures done on scene. When you start looking again at the odds ratio of getting a better or worse outcomes in terms of mortality, turns out the only one that really significantly improves your overall survival rate or is associated with overall improved survival rate, not necessarily increasing it, was actually getting IV access. Interestingly enough, tourniquets or the use of tourniquets was not associated with an increase in improvement in outcomes. You guys probably see the same thing where you're at as well. Many of the tourniquets that apply are applied inappropriately or not necessarily patients who will benefit from them. Simply because you're shot in an arm or leg does not mean you need a tourniquet, but frequently it's applied anyway, just because of the training programs that are out there, such as Stop the Bleed, et cetera. The things that were associated with worse outcomes, again, use of C-spine immobilization, pleural decompression, intubation, et cetera, which again also may be associated with patients with higher levels or significant degrees of injury, but performing these procedures was associated with worse outcomes. Bottom line, I think when you look at this, I think the data more and more suggests that getting patients to the hospital faster, particularly with penetrating trauma, avoiding any kind of process procedures, prior to getting to the hospital. And this includes during transport from this particular study. Getting them to the hospital is probably the best bet you've got if you have a reasonable transport time. Because again, most of these studies are done in the urban settings where there really isn't these really prolonged transport times where, again, you do probably have time to do procedures and or evaluate the patient more thoroughly. So this particular set of figures is actually what I call a conversion set. It's similar to those dime store figure you saw earlier. Again, but this is one where an individual went in, kind of changed them around, put masks on the figures, put hats on them, repainted them, et cetera. This is the only anesthesia person I have in my entire collection. And only because I asked one individual to make one for me. This is the chloroform anesthetic going on and the surgeon on the right there standing ready to operate. All right, so if I say the word big and trauma, I don't know what you think of initially. Certainly it could be the trauma of having to watch Tom Hanks in Big a number of years ago. But right now, BIG stands for Brain Injury Guidelines. BIG is not the full set of guidelines we have for the management of the patient with traumatic brain injury that's put out by the National Brain Trauma Foundation periodically. This is a different set of guidelines that were established to help emergency medicine and acute care, trauma surgeons deal with patients with relatively minor head injuries and maybe perhaps improving the overall triage and management of those patients. This was actually based off initially a single center trial where they actually looked at their data and they put people into three categories: a big one, a big two, or a big three. These are patients who showed up with some degree of traumatic brain injury. And again, if you look at the categories there, loss of consciousness, they may or may not have lost consciousness. For the big one category, these are people who actually show up with a normal neuro exam. They're not intoxicated. They don't have a skull fracture. These are the ones who have that trace subarachnoid, maybe just a little small intraparenchymal hemorrhage, small subdural or epidural, but no intraventricular hemorrhage. And also, one of the categories that's not mentioned on here, but should be on there, is CAMP, so the presence of Coumadin, aspirin, Plavix, any other anticoagulants. And of course, that would be a big no for the big one group here. Now, typically, if you're institutions like ours, even these patients with minor head injury, the neurosurgeons are consulted, they come down, they want to see a repeat head CT in 6 hours, and then they clear the patient if they need to go to the surgery for that wrist fracture or something else that may have been, happened during that same accident where the TBI occurred. Or they have to hang around the hospital for 24 hours getting repeat head CTs, et cetera. What they found in this one single center trial initially was that it probably didn't make much difference. Again, because even if you didn't get a repeat head CT, didn't get a neurosurgical consultations, patients did fine, could have been discharged more rapidly after 6 hours of observation. The big two category were ones where there was intoxication present, so perhaps clouding the exam. There may be a skull fracture. The bleeds are a little bit bigger, a little bit more prominent there, where again, the recommendation would be to keep the patient there for 24-hour observation, but still not get that repeat head CT and not call neurosurgery unless something in the exam changed. And finally, the big three are the ones where clearly you're going to get neurosurgery involved. You're going to get repeat head CT, even if there's not necessarily an indication for immediately going to the operating room for neurosurgical intervention. And the big three also includes those patients who may be on Coumadin, aspirin, or Plavix, may be more prone to have an extension of a pre-existing bleed. So what the group did here, and this came from the AAST, was they wanted to validate these guidelines. So they did a prospective multi-institutional trial, simply observational, 10 level 1 and 2 trauma centers. They found all the adult patients with TBI who had initial positive head CT, again, meeting some of those criteria between the big 1 and the big 3. There they were able to identify a total of 2,000 patients who had no missing data. And what they did was they kind of looked to see how these patients were managed. Now, again, this wasn't a trial where people were prospectively put into one of these three categories and then managed in a certain way. They allowed the baseline typical management of the patients to occur and then looked at the outcomes and wanted to compare whether if they had not gotten repeat head CTs, if they had not gotten neurosurgical consultation, would it have changed the outcome and management of those patients? And in reality, just like most centers, I suspect, and like ours here, there was repeat head CTs done in the majority of these patients, even those who fell in the big 1 and big 2 category. These were routine measures in almost all of these patients. Neurosurgical consultation was frequently obtained, up to almost 90% of these patients, and a prolonged hospitalization, so keeping them longer than that 6 or 24-hour period, also occurred in the majority of these patients. Now, when they went back and applied those big criteria to what could have been the assigned to therapeutic plan, they found that all those patients that were in the big 1 category ended up being discharged ultimately anyway, with no additional neurosurgical intervention, no increase in their upgrading care, et cetera. They could have been watched for 6 hours, had a normal exam, and been discharged without getting all those other things done. For the big 2 category, again, these people with slightly bigger bleeds, maybe some intoxication or skull fracture. 288 of those patients, again, had no change, would not have needed the stuff that was done. There were 7 patients, however, that kind of shifted over to that big 3 category. So think about 3% of patients. 5 of those patients had worsened CTs on the repeat head CTs that was done. So about 2%. 2 of the patients had neurodecline, and 1 of those 2 patients also had a change in their head CT. Interestingly enough, all these patients were upgraded to ICU care. They were observed. None required neurosurgical intervention. So again, outcome didn't change, but their care and their management actually did change, and there was an indication for getting, and having had the CTs done, but not necessarily having a worsened CT associated with a change in the overall management of the patient if they hadn't done the CT. Interestingly enough, because these are the little things we're talking about, that little bit of subarachnoid hemorrhage that occurs, and not uncommonly in some patients, particularly now that we have the better quality scanners that we use on a regular basis. But the bottom line, again, was that none of the big 1 or 2 patients required neurosurgical intervention. No TBI-related ED visits or readmissions among the big 1 or 2 patients. So even if they were discharged, they didn't come back with problems. And then implementing it would have actually saved 425 CT scans, 401 admissions, and 511 neurosurgical consultations out of 2,000 patients. So pretty big impact. From the anesthesia perspective, what this really means to me is that if these patients have to come to the OR, they can probably come to the OR faster. There is no reason to wait for that repeat head CT. That frequently we get when we say, okay, is this patient cleared to come to the OR? The answer is no, we're waiting on a head CT for neurosurgery to look at it to clear the patient. Now they can go to the OR. Now it's 5 in the afternoon, let's just do the surgery tomorrow kind of thing, for that wrist fracture. So it may have something that if it does get employed and get integrated into practice elsewhere, can improve sort of patient flow, if you will, up to the operative setting if there are other associated injuries, with confidence that you're probably not going to be missing an underlying injury or exacerbating that underlying injury. Now, at the same time, I can tell you, if you look at a very similar process out there, the use of these high quality CT scans to actually evaluate these patients with spinal cord injury, who may or may not be cleared. But if you get a good high quality CT scan in an obtunded patient, the current recommendation is that you can probably clear their neck based on that alone. And that's published in several of these surgical guidelines right now. At the same time, our institution still gets MRIs of the C-spine to clear it in an obtunded patient. They have not converted over simply because they had one case 8 years ago where someone actually worsened, even with a normal CT. Turns out they actually missed something on the CT. So technically, we're pretty much right there with that recommendation if we chose to implement it. But there may be the sort of medical, legal, cover your butt thing to actually kind of keep us from moving forward on things like the big scoring system, as well as things like that spinal cord clearance with the CT scanning. In addition to collecting toy soldiers, I also collect all the vehicles that kind of go along with them. This is actually a 10-plate vehicle made between World War I and World War II. Again, allows you to put the characters in there and play with it. It serves as a great backdrop for a lot of the pieces in my collection. So we're going to move on to another part of neurotrauma here. This one actually refers to spinal cord injury. If you've ever seen it before, there's this process you can do where you can take a word or a phrase, put it into a system, and it creates a word cloud. And the size of the words, the darkness actually is related to how frequently you're found associated on the web in different articles, different sources, et cetera. Turns out when you put spinal cord injuries in, this is what you get for at least one individual who did this. And if you look on there, there's one little corner thing down here, it's something called regeneration. I know for years we've talked about, the potential for improving spinal cord injury outcomes by getting regeneration of nerves, getting growth and extension. But to a large degree, that just doesn't happen because the level and significant degree of injury, the hemorrhage, the contusion, kind of creates almost like an area of injury that just doesn't allow for propagation. Well, it turns out some individuals have been working for a number of years on these materials that can be implanted into the spinal cord and serve as a matrix or a growth to allow some of these nerves to regenerate and or reconnect and or get additional function back. Really, this one is called a neurospinal scaffold. And it just so happens that last year, they actually published for the first time a study of patients who have had these implants put in. This was an in vivo study looking for a possible benefit of the NSS for safety and neurological recovery in patients with complete thoracic spinal cord injury. I believe they went from levels T2 to T12. These had to be relatively healthy patients. This implant is like, again, a very porous sort of bioresorbable polymer compound, required surgery, required a durotomy to open up the dura, expose the spinal cord, you sucked out the clot, you put the material back into the cord itself. And they enrolled 19 patients who were Asia grade A. So again, no function down distal to the level of injury. And the surgery had to take place within 96 hours of injury. That was just based on the protocol. There's no really guidance on why that would or would not be beneficial, but needs to be done fairly early on if you're gonna make a decision for this. And they just published their 6-month data, which again, at that 6-month point, 7 of 16 patients had conversion from complete to incomplete injuries. 5 of these went to a grade B, which again, small improvement, getting some, sort of sensation down distally. 2 of them also had improvement to a grade C. Now, again, there really wasn't a prospective control design to this, so they're using historical controls, and they believe that this outcomes exceeded what you would typically see in a historical kind of environment. They didn't report any complications, infections, or anything else associated with this. And now, based on that, they're actually moving on to a second trial, the Inspire True trial. Now, I got to tell you, this trial actually started in 2014. It took them 8 years to get this enrollment, publication, et cetera. The next one, they're actually looking to get 35 patients in, and it's going to be a randomized trial, surgery versus surgery and this implant for stabilization. One of the things, and again, I kind of wanted to work this in here somehow, and this was the best recent paper I had for this, is that it's not clear that the NSS is actually the beneficial component to this. It could actually be that durotomy that people are making. There's been a lot of interest lately in spinal cord injury. We go in, we do all these stabilizations, sometimes they open the dura, et cetera. They close it back up. And when you do that, what happens? The cord swells, it's in a tight container. It's similar to having sort of that increase in ICP with a contusion and hematoma, get an increase in your intracranial pressure, but getting an increase in your intraspinal pressure. And it's well documented that if you actually measure intraspinal pressures, that they're relatively reduced until you close the dura, you wake the patient up, and they can start going up to extremely high levels. So if you think that pressure may actually impede local perfusion, very likely. So what neurosurgeons are now looking to do is something what they call duroplasty, where they can actually go in, excise the dura, perhaps put a graft on it, but kind of give, again, the spinal cord room to grow, similar to doing a decompressive craniotomy. And again, with this particular surgery, it turns out that when they place that NSS, they do make a durotomy, they do remove the contusion, and maybe the benefit we're seeing is a decrease in the intraspinal pressures. Very interesting thought or concept, but also something that may be coming to an OR or neuro ICU near you if it's not already there, is this concept of measuring intraspinal pressures and doing treatment, modalities, management, et cetera, specifically targeting the ISP, just like we do for that cerebral perfusion pressure. But again, something to think about. There is another study that's coming out there. It's actually called the Discus trial. That's a duroplasty for injured spinal cord with uncontrolled swelling. That again is going to sort of randomize to this duroplasty versus no duroplasty. And we may see yet another way that we can again potentially benefit our spinal cord injury patients in the post-operative period or in the perioperative period to kind of improve outcomes. All right. Here's another one of those figures that I've been collecting for a number of years. These are actually what they call composition figures. They're actually made out of kind of a glue, kaolin, sawdust composition, goes into a mold, gets pressed down, so it's more of a woody texture to it. These can be done in a number of different paint jobs, number of different designs, number of different heights, but they're actually, I think, a little bit more expressive than some of the metal figures that I've got in my collection. Well, I knew you knew I couldn't get past recent 10 papers without at least getting somewhere into whole blood. I understand that you guys have access to whole blood in your institution for management of traumatically injured patients, just like we do ourselves. This particular trial just got published April 2022, and again, looking at the impact of incorporating whole blood into hemorrhagic shock resuscitation. This was analysis of almost 1,400 patients at a single institution receiving emergency release uncross-matched blood products. Now, only 840 of those patients actually got whole blood, but they had a component group, as sort of a comparative group in this particular study. And reporting on their outcomes, what they found is that, again, when you actually break it down, the whole blood group at baseline was a little bit sicker than you might expect. I don't know about your institutional protocols, but in ours, blood pressure is a trigger for whole blood, level and depth of shock is a trigger. So there's reasons why people who are sicker sometimes get whole blood as opposed to component therapy earlier in their management. And when you look at it, the arrival systolic blood pressure, the arrival GCS, lactate, even some of the minor changes in sort of the viscoelastic testing were all present in the group that got whole blood to a greater degree than those who got component therapy. So again, a little bit of selection bias in there. Nonetheless, when you look at this, consider the fact those patients were a little bit sicker, turns out that the use of whole blood was actually associated with a significant increase in survival. And was probably the most prominent factor identified, other than age, gender, degree of severity, which you might expect here. Seen systolic blood pressure didn't make a difference, but arrival lactate did. Even when you look at it from a weighted perspective, still the most predominant and likely predictor of survival at 30 days was getting into that whole blood group and getting it early. So again, a little bit more ammunition kind of pushes towards using whole blood in our more sicker patients. Interestingly enough, when you actually look at the raw univariate analysis, just head to head, the survival in each group to discharge was similar, 75 versus 76%. But again, suggesting that it's those patients who are sicker, more severely injured, again, who are more likely to die, are less likely to do so if they get whole blood as part of that. And the graph that I think sums it up best is this one here. Again, sort of looking at that probability of survival across the entire range of severity scores here. And again, on the left graph, it's from 0 to 15, expanded out a little bit. On the right-hand side is 15 to up over 60, almost 70. And you'll see that the real benefit here really falls in that category in those patients with ISSs, kind of approaching 10 up to, maybe 20. The more severely injured patients, even whole blood may not make much of a difference. Again, no statistical difference in this particular trial. And obviously those patients with very minor injuries, the use of your whole blood for them is probably not warranted as well. When you match this up with other data that's coming out here, and this was a survey completed recently of our trauma centers on who's using whole blood, turns out that, again, there's been a significant increase over the last 15 years. There in black, sort of that low titer group O whole blood. And again, this was a survey that was done in 187 level 1 trauma centers. Response rate was almost 55%. So we figured it might be a little bit of bias towards those who actually are using it versus those who aren't. The survey was completed just last year, and what they found is that 42% of us are already using whole blood. Another 14% are planning on it. Another 45 have not gotten there yet. The other one that I thought was interesting out of that survey is that when you actually look at it, very few institutions have no limit on the amount of whole blood. Be interested in, at the end of this, hearing how much you guys have access to. We certainly in our institution can get up to about 10 units, and that's where we stop. And again, there's a few that can actually go well beyond that, but typically, not typically in most settings. And a lot of that has to do with availability, how much blood is allotted on a weekly basis, because again, we don't keep huge stocks of whole blood available, just due to concerns about wastage and loss. Certainly, I think, again, the trial we're talking about does support, again, the concept that whole blood may improve outcomes, at least in a selected group of patients. And again, we need to keep working on identifying when and how to deliver that to the patients. Another little set here. This is actually one from France. France, turns out, makes a lot of their figures out of aluminum, probably back about the 1940s, 50s, probably 1950s, actually. And again, very cool little piece that I was looking at. You see the price tag on there? Yeah, that was not that expensive compared to some that I bought over the years. When I asked the surgeons, this was one paper that came up from several different surgeons as something that's going to change practice. And that is the management of these subclavian artery injuries, both in penetrating and blunt mechanisms. As you can see here, the big concern is this is a major vessel that gets injured. Frequently, it's under the clavicle. It's hard to compress. It's hard to control. In a recent trial, or recent review, I should say, of the Trauma Quality Improvement Program database, looking at patients who had endovascular stenting versus open management, again, they were able to identify 737 patients. Over a third of them had penetrating injuries. And again, this is replacement of a stent or occlusion of the vessel to manage the injuries. And I think the biggest thing here, we was looking at mortality, and this is what really got our surgeons all fired up. We have a very active vascular trauma program. But again, in blunt injury, it didn't really matter, open versus endo. So again, doing it endovascularly probably is beneficial. But when you look at the penetrating mechanism, big difference in mortality, open versus closed. These are very bloody procedures, sometimes difficult to get a hold of vascular control. So again, interesting. Also, but again, what the surgeons don't always tell you about when they're looking at this, there's probably some selection bias to this as well, and those patients who may benefit from open versus closed. Again, not sure how that works out. We recently have put together, and this is not a picture of our unit because I forgot to grab one the other day, but it's the same device, the Zigo, the same table. Doing things endovascularly adds additional complexity to what we do. We don't have access to extremities. During the case, if we need to get more IV access, can't get to the head frequently, got to do all your lines and everything before you get to the patient. And when you have to convert to an open procedure, you're now in a room that's typically not as well set up for that massive resuscitation there. Now, like I've always said, interventional radiology, it's like surgery, only magic. And our surgeons have very much adopted this approach, and we are doing a ton of endovascular stuff now for management of our trauma patients. And again, I think it's going to be a continuing involvement to push towards that way. Problem is, if you only have one unit, what do you do for that second or third patient who may need access as well? So we're still doing things on the old tables with vascular fluoroscopy. And again, seems to work pretty well for most patients. But again, I think this is something, if you're not doing it now, your hospital is going to be acquiring a unit like this, and you're going to find yourself having to staff it on a regular basis with all of the additional impediments put in place by the system, the table design, et cetera. Going back are some more of those composition style figures. One thing you'll notice here is that these are all essentially the same body. What they frequently did is they made molds of different heads, and the heads are actually inserted in separately. And then you could paint it up and you could have multiple different nationalities, which is like British, German. I think the one in blue and green there is supposed to be Serbian, French, Italian, et cetera. So one of the other things hard to get away from right nowadays is the fact that Reboa is still a big deal out there. If you actually look at the most recent issue, the Journal of Trauma and Acute Care Surgery, earlier this year, they had one that was pretty much dedicated to a lot of papers related to Reboa. They're publishing additional algorithms, again, critical decision-making and the use of Reboa and its deployment. They're talking about doing it for pediatrics now. We have noticed there have been limb ischemic complications associated with Robo in the past, really looking at an assessment of the risk benefit, life over limb of that. And then again, just kind of summarizing it in another article as well. And when you actually look at that Western Association for Trauma critical decisions algorithm that came out in that issue, one area where there's been a recent publication really looks at, from the AAST, really looked at the benefit of Robo for a select patient population. I think the blush is off. We put a lot of Robos in initially. We're being a lot more selective now in those patients that we think may actually benefit from it. It turns out there's a survival benefit. Again, when you look at the AAST aortic occlusion for resuscitation and trauma and acute care surgery, the aorta registry, people voluntarily submit all their cases from multiple institutions now. There were 8 when it started. There's up to 45 of them now that are using Roboas. They've managed to already collect almost 1,500 patients in that database. But again, all voluntarily submitted data. Examined outcomes of non-compressible hemorrhage below the aortic bifurcation was the most recent assessment they've done. So again, these are patients who essentially had injuries below the level of the bifurcation. Mostly you can think about pelvic injuries, pelvic fractures, et cetera. And again, they found 217 patients in that study group with zone 3 Roboa placement, so down below the level of the renal arteries. And then again, as compared to open aortic occlusion, now they don't specifically say whether it was a thoracotomy with aortic occlusion or whether it was something done intra-abdominally, but with aortic occlusion compared to Roboa, there were 109 patients with injuries isolated below the aortic bifurcation. 84 had Roboa, 25 had an open aortic occlusion. When you look at the outcomes in these trials, again, the mortality with CPR was significantly better in those patients, say lower, those patients were Roboa versus those who had ED thoracotomies. So again, aortic cross clamp placed within the chest. The mortality in the patients who were not undergoing CPR on arrival, again, also significantly improved compared to an ED thoracotomy. Now, again, this is a little bit of a question to me because they don't clearly address this in the paper. My understanding is that patients who show up with CPR on arrival, so trauma arrest, Roboa is supposed to be placed in zone 1. So it's unclear to me why it ended up in zone 3 on these patients, unless it was initially placed in zone 1 and then backed down to zone 3. Something I've seen our surgeons do on a couple different occasions. Now realize that this is not a randomized trial and there's a very high likelihood of selection bias. When you actually look at the patient characteristics here, and again, those who had penetrating mechanisms versus blunt trauma, they were much more likely to get the ED thoracotomy with a penetrating mechanism as compared to Roboa. So again, patients more likely to have significant complications or mortality associated with that. With blunt trauma, again, not statistically different in how it was distributed there. But when you look at the actual hemodynamics, this is where that critical thought comes in. Again, those who had systolic blood pressure was lower and heart rate that was lower, again, suggesting profound shocks since they were no longer tachycardic. And those with the worst GCS, again, here 4.4 versus 9.3 in the Roboa group, they got an ED thoracotomy. So again, sicker patient population doesn't do as well. You may just be reporting on sort of standard outcomes with or without any management for this patient population. So again, not clear that it absolutely is linked to the use of the Roboa versus ED thoracotomies in my mind. The other thing we've talked about a lot has been this risk benefit of the Roboa. We've seen amputations. We've been back to the OR multiple times for thrombectomies, embolectomies, certainly something that we need to think about. 14 of 54 Roboa survivors had vascular complications. So they will end up back in the OR. Not always for an amputation. I think in this particular trial, the patients they selected, none of them ultimately ended up with an amputation, but they did require other management. So again, life over limb. If you look at who's actually doing these procedures here, again, the current recommendation is if you should be replaced by a surgeon or interventionalist responsible for definitive hemorrhage control, or by a physician trained and qualified in Roboa and direct consultation with a physician who provide definitive hemorrhage control. So think about it, trauma surgeons, ED physicians, et cetera. One of the questions we've had is that outside of the OR, Roboa can also be used in many other places. When you think about abdominal hemorrhage, one of the big ones where it had been discussed has been things like maternal hemorrhage, where again, there's not going to be a vascular surgeon or an ED physician sitting up in that labor and delivery suite. But guess who's going to be up there? It's going to be you and I. So the question is, should anesthesiologists get more involved in learning how to use and replace a Reboa? Problem is, you're in a place like ours. I suspect that trauma surgeons and the ED guys will always be doing it outside of the OR because they're always there. Similarly, if we had a non-trauma case where Reboa was indicated, and it's been done a few times in our institution with placental abruption, et cetera, actually, we can get a surgeon pretty quickly. But in other places where they may not be available in-house, but again, someone who can get vascular access, who can do it with ultrasound or without ultrasound, who has an understanding of what it means to have aortic occlusion, perhaps this is something we need to learn about. For those of y'all who are, the Walking Dead fans, again, life over limb is certainly an issue. But I think in this case, just like it is with zombie attacks, I think I'll pick life over limb in most settings. All right, moving on to another piece of my collection. This is actually another one of those little ambulances designed to go with those composition style figures I talked to you about. Again, in the old days, it wasn't just motorized. You had the horses pulling the ambulance as well. So looking at my time here, I'm actually getting pretty close to the end of my time. So I will certainly kind of pick it up a little bit here. This is one that I thought was very interesting. Again, I think of alchemy as being something that's sort of like, taking a bunch of random things, putting together and making something that it's not. To me, it kind of comes out like ERAS or this opioid-free analgesia concept, where we start mixing large numbers of medications, trying to improve overall outcomes based on the fact that each one may provide some small benefit, hoping for some bigger benefit in our outcomes. It turns out we're starting to head that way with trauma resuscitation now. One of the things that I've seen kind of out there getting pushed pretty strongly now and kind of increasing in the frequency of publications is ALM. And what's ALM? It's adenosine, lidocaine, and magnesium. This little combination, again, has been suggested as being somewhat cardioprotective. Certainly it's been used in cardioplegia, but in lower concentrations may actually be cardioprotective. It may also have some resuscitative properties, and certainly in models of cardiac arrest and hemorrhage, it's linked to reduction in metabolic demand, decrease in inflammatory markers, et cetera. And when you see papers like this published, now this is a mouse study where you basically go in and resect a chunk of the mouse's liver, he bleeds like stink, you close him back up, and it's an uncontrolled hemorrhage. And 100% with ALM given, after the injury versus 100% death if you only gave saline for volume resuscitation. Wow, I mean, this must be like the miracle drug, right? When you actually look at the mean arterial pressures, I think all we see here is that with the ALM, the patients, the rats, were actually fairly hypotensive during that conscious period there. The ones with saline actually had higher blood pressures. And maybe we did prove with this study was that whole concept of if I keep your blood pressure higher, you're just going to keep bleeding. If I actually get you a little hypotensive, you may actually have a better chance of clotting. Unclear. But this group with Dr. Dobson from down in Australia has published a large number of publications very much in favor and supporting the concept of these three agents as improving survival when you can't get to definitive therapy. Now, this was also repeated using a very similar concoction in a large animal model, but now instead of using saline, using something more traditional, the tactical combat casualty care resuscitation model, where they did the same thing. Interestingly enough, the exact opposite. That group in purple down there to the right, that's the group that did not get ALM. All the ones that got ALM did not do as well. Led to actually some pretty significant fun letters. If you ever go back and look these studies up, there's some letters to the editor that followed on this, accusing each other of not using the right combination, having precipitation, not cooperating, not participating, not talking to each other, but then, the other guy saying you did. So very much kind of some open arguments occurring there about which is the best way to do this. The most recent trial that actually tried to incorporate this is actually a Reboa occlusion model, where they simply bled them out through an intravenous line, 20% hemorrhage, then resuscitated with or without the ALM using hypertonic saline, blew the balloon up in zone 1, and then went ahead, kept an infusion running with and without the ALM. So again, not clear how much of that fluid was getting down distally. But again, when you looked at it, the ALM group had changes in their hemodynamics with a decrease in cardiac output and cardiac index. There was some reduction in inflammatory signaling when you actually look at it. But this really brought to me more this question of what we're doing in terms of resuscitation. I don't know how you guys do it when you have a Reboa going up, but for us, now we're using the newer version where they have 2 pressure lines above and below the balloon, so they in theory can let the balloon down, get some distal perfusion, assess more proximally the tip of the catheter up in the arch if it's in zone 1. But again, do you guys have time to give additional medications, hang more infusions of another drug that's likely, based on most of the data, actually to decrease your blood pressure in the setting of ongoing hemorrhage and ongoing resuscitation? And again, we already have trouble even trying to get the 2 Reboa arterial lines hooked up and run up the head of the bed while they're draping, prepping for that emergent exploratory laparotomy. I think this is one of the things that's going to need a little bit more time to figure out how best to do this. Ultimately, you get it down to a single vial, a single injection. Coming back to the OR before the Reboa goes up, perhaps it will have some benefit in the long run. One last thing here, sort of my toy soldier collection. Again, these are sort of what I call flat figures. Believe it or not, these are actually very flat metal, and all the detail here is painted on. So it kind of gives it that 3D look. And a lot of these figures were made in Germany and have been for probably over 100 years now. They've made those style of figures. So one article that one of my colleagues, Justin Richards, had turned me on to a while back, really looked at this concept of how well end-tidal CO2 measurements predict outcomes. Again, during hemorrhagic shock, we know that low cardiac output leads to inadequate perfusion and poor gas exchange. Again, increase in your anatomic dead space, and you'll see a larger and larger gradient between your arterial and your end-tidal CO2. Again, suggesting that low perfusion state. And again, that correlates with level of injury, mortality, and a number of in-hospital studies of injured patients. A lot of different ways to measure end-tidal CO2, but in this trial, what they did is they looked at all the patients who pre-hospital had been intubated and had measurements of end-tidal CO2 in the field. They went back and looked at those, and they identified 1,300 patients here in this retrospective trial, and found that, again, monitoring end-tidal CO2, again, this is one of those receiver operating curves where, again, looking at sensitivity and specificity, what you want to see is kind of that curve here that kind of, if it ideally goes up and over, the closer you get up here, the better it's doing. In this particular trial, again, using end-tidal CO2, it was better than systolic blood pressure, better than stroke index in predicting some of your different outcomes. In this particular one, it was mortality and also massive transfusion. So again, if you had a lower end-tidal CO2, much more likely to do a massive transfusion, but again, not perfect in its predictive capability. I think when I see it nowadays, it's not just useful in the pre-hospital setting. This is one of the monitors I look at very closely during our resuscitation and our trauma resuscitation unit. So again, when patients show up and you hook them up to the ventilator or hook them up to the bag, you're bagging them when they first show up, and you look up and the end-tidal CO2 is 15 or 10, that's usually not hyperventilation. That is usually just another assessment of their overall volume status. And you watch that as you're kind of bringing the patients along. And like that green line, again, this is one from cardiac arrest. When you get that return of spontaneous circulation or an improvement in your overall perfusion, you see an increase in that end-tidal CO2. Again, when you've gotten the patient back with epi and everything else, the number shoots up, you can watch that number drift right back down if the patient's not been adequately volume resuscitated. So I think end-tidal CO2, we just need to work out how best to use that in our overall resuscitation of our patients. Now, I believe I have one more article here. So run over just a little bit on our time, but we'll be doing pretty good for a little less than an hour. Those composition figures I showed you before also had a lot of different types of hospitals, believe it or not, you could actually incorporate into this. And I've got a number of trenches and first aid stations that were designed specifically for those things. And these are all date back to about the 1930s, 1940s make. I don't know about your situation, but again, at shock trauma, what you're looking at here on the right is bay number 1. What you're looking at on the left down there are operating rooms. So effectively, shock trauma pretty much has the ability to get from a trauma bay to an OR in the matter of a minute. And it's not uncommon for us to grab the patient, head straight down the hallway. The first OR is like right down here on your right-hand side, not even halfway down that hallway there. And again, you may also notice if you look by that left-hand side there, you also see our viscoelastic monitoring. We're still using the old version, which is why that one looks a little funky there, I think. Again, I think this is one where the table got bumped. But again, Justin Richards with us is working with our laboratory folks to actually get us upgraded to the latest versions of the TEG or the ROTAM. So again, we can go to more of the cartridge-based systems and have that viscoelastic testing monitoring immediately available in a much more functional format than it currently is. But outside of our institution, there are other places where they actually have been able to integrate a ED operating room, either in or is associated with their trauma base. And this really comes up because, again, it's Chris Stevens down in Houston, and I kind of put together a paper not too long ago looking at their experience in direct to OR admissions, which again was somewhat anecdotal, but they actually have a direct to OR score in their system there. And with that system, they are able to, look at the mechanism of injury, whether or not they have positive FAST, hypotension, significant base excess. And patients who get 3 of those points or greater in that top scoring system there can actually qualify to go straight to the OR. Again, you need the manpower, you need the support, you need to have the availability to do that, and sufficient warning to actually get an OR ready and available. I say that, but then speaking to one of my colleagues who was out at LA County, she had told me just, like 3 hours before, she had gotten a call that a patient was in the OR. There they had the system where surgeons could bring a patient straight up to the OR and essentially notify you when they got to the OR. So again, making it somewhat difficult to be prepared and ready for a case, and kind of, making that transition a little more abrupt than perhaps it needs to be in some cases. But there's no reason you can't bring patients straight to the OR. And this is actually the experience of one institution where, again, they did a single center, level 1 trauma center. I believe this is up in Philly at Thomas Jefferson. And again, what they did is they looked at a level 1 trauma center where they had an ED in the operating room in their ED, and they propensity matched cases from their ED/OR cases to those that were available in the National Trauma Bank for things like age, gender, injury severity score, et cetera, mechanism. And we had 120 patients that they did here. And what they were looking at was how fast they could get to incision. Because again, even if you have an ED in the OR, you still got to open the equipment. You've got to get the people there because they're not sitting there in the OR ready to do an operation to see if it actually would be associated with markers that might be linked with better outcomes. For secondary outcomes, they looked at mortality, length of stay, and transfusion. Now, their criteria were not quite as good as Houston's. They were much more general. But as you can see, patients who were much more likely to need early and immediate operation as deemed by their initial evaluation. That's the one when the EMS is calling in and they're talking to you and you're going to take that patient to the OR pretty rapidly. And when you look at time to incision, this is just sort of the mean and average here. But when you actually look at the median time, it was about 25 versus 40 minutes for the EDR versus the historical controls they pulled out of the National Trauma Data Bank, from other institutions. Again, cutting about 15 minutes off of that time to getting started. Now, because of small numbers, there were no difference in mortality. They did notice that they had shorter length of stay, and they ended up needing fewer units of blood for transfusion. Now, again, when you think about your resuscitations, most of our resuscitation bays are relatively small. And I'd like to think that they all look like this, a very well-organized, controlled system. Unfortunately, this is what most of our trauma bays look like when we have these emergency admissions, even the ones that need to go to the OR. And it's frequently necessary to kind of, again, control the chaos and get the patient to the OR as fast as possible. But I think, again, what this suggests that if we have capability of doing this a little closer to the source or bypassing the ED correctly, because that's sort of the other alternative, is not necessarily going to the OR and the ED, but taking the patient straight to the OR and skipping the ED might be beneficial if you have the resources and the capabilities to do that. So I'm going to finish up right now showing you one last thing, and this is for my toy soldier collection as well. It used to be in the old days, you could actually buy kits that allow you to make toy soldiers. And yes, with molten lead. I always love when it shows up in the upper left-hand corner there. This is something you'd give to your kids, right? And again, I think if you actually read the package insert, nowhere on there does it say adult supervision required. So again, I think our package warnings have significantly changed over the years as well. So bottom line, for what I've been talking about today, yeah, this is just my point of view. I mean, I picked 10 papers that I think have specific elements that either are currently at play in our management of traumatically injured patients or may lead to changes down the line. And what I think I'd like to do at this point, first I'm gonna look, I see no comments in the chat, but certainly if Justin is still here with us. Are you, Justin?
I'm here.
Yeah. I can open up for discussion. I mean, if there's any of those topics there that folks have experience with, beyond what I've read in the literature or have personal experience with, I think it'd be great for folks to chime in with what they think is important or things I may have missed.
I mean, I'll tell you, I mean, right from the beginning, bringing up the hip fractures and arguing about general versus spinal, I was staring at a patient today wondering that. And you know, having seen that article and saying it's like, are there situations where we just preferentially will want to do it? So I mean, even today, that paper came up today. No, I think they're fantastic papers. A lot of stuff that's really useful, and it's just stuff that we need to be thinking about and need to know that it's out there, and need to know, like you said, this should impact how we practice. I know we're running over, but does anyone else have any comments or questions? Anything they want to share?
Tom, this is Albert. Very nice presentation. I really appreciate it. I have a question for you. So in Maryland, C-collars are not coming off still until you get patient takes it off, patient gets a craniotomy or gets an MRI, or once the patient is extubated going home and they stay forever, despite the fact that the guidelines have changed that said that even if you're blunt, even if you're unconscious, high resolution CT clears the C-spine. Your practice hasn't changed yet, or the guidelines have not. Just like our place, it takes a while for those people to get the message.
I think they're starting to change. For patients who are awake and talking, even if they're intoxicated now and they have the good clear CT scan, I'm seeing some of our younger surgeons clearing them more rapidly. I think the original guidelines are really specifically targeting obtunded patients. But obtunded versus awake, I mean, it's essentially, it makes it easier.
All our patients are drunk or obtunded, and otherwise we would never be able to clear the C-spine. Listen, if I can share my screen, I want to show you just a couple of things that may be of your interest. Can I do that?
Sure, absolutely. And now I've got a question I'll answer here in a second. Too.
Yeah, regarding end-tidal CO2, Roman did a study at our own institution and did find the end-tidal CO2 at the beginning of trauma surgery to be predictive to non-survival. So we do use that as one of our indicators that was published about 3 years ago. So I just wanted to, this came out of our institution. The other thing I wanted to share with you is the fact that, I'm going to suggest that you don't get rid of those Y ties because things come back. This paper was done 30 years ago. And at that time, we were using intravenous folate, lidocaine, vitamin C, selenium, mannitol, polymyxin, and hydrocortisone, and vitamins in all trauma patients coming in. We used to call it IRP, ischemia reperfusion protocol, and it didn't pan out. The studies in rats did not pan out in our patients. I've just got interest because of the study that you mentioned, talking about giving antioxidants and all that, just definitely got my attention from that standpoint. But it was a very nice review of the papers that you did, all the ones that we're looking at. I appreciate it. And I'll let other people comment.
Yeah, I saw a comment from Dr. Chang here, was asking about how our neurosurgeons feel about all the neurosurgical consults, for this case with modest CT findings. I think they have like a cut and paste rubber stamp sort of thing. I think they just look at the patients, meet those criteria, and cut and paste in their recommendations.
It always says no absolute contraindication for emergency surgery. Please use an awake. Please do awake fibrotic intubation.
Yeah, I think, but again, they will hold up urgent but non-emergent, non-emergent surgery, but relatively urgent. They'll still hold it up. Because the patient may be in the hospital not for the head injury, but the head injury is coincidental finding, and almost invariably they want that repeat CT before they clear them for the OR. Now that may be part of our trauma team as well, just because of the traditional training to actually see those CT scans, evaluate them, and make a decision.
You're lucky. In our place, they want the CT scan before and after, like if it was OB, so you know where the problem happened. But they will not hold the patient for surgery.
Any questions or any thoughts from other folks? Things I missed in there? Because again, like I said, it's just an open discussion. If there's something you think is coming out that you think is going to change our practice, love to hear.
I think the use of whole blood is coming up next because we're seeing anecdotally improved outcomes, and actually makes it much faster when you're doing an MTP. You don't have to worry about ratios, et cetera, et cetera. So I think we're going to be seeing more of that.
Yeah, one of my questions, and again, this is just my brain, how my brain works. I remember Rick Dutton, and many of y'all may know Rick Dutton as, the former kind of head here at Shock Trauma, still talks about trauma.
I believe he's on. I believe Rick's is on. It says Rick's iPhone, so maybe he's here.
Usually with a K though, but it could be Rick.
Okay.
I remember showing me a paper years ago, an abstract. I don't know if it ever got published, which is out of LA County. And this was back when we first started doing the one-to-one transfusion thing, a lot more frequently. It was getting a big deal. So back early 2000s. And what they showed was that when they went to one, they decreased their blood product usage, their pack cell usage, but they replaced it almost 1-for-1 with FFP. Many times early on in resuscitation, volume is volume is volume, again, and I don't know, what I'd love to see is the volume of whole blood versus the volume of pack cells and FFP mixed together, not the unit numbers. Because we always talk about unit numbers. A unit of whole blood is more volume than a component, right? So the question is it the volume or is it the product itself? And again, I think that's what we haven't always clearly distinguished when some of these whole blood studies, because they look at total number of units, not total volume of blood product transfused. Does it make sense? And I would love to see that kind of included in some of these future studies. But you're right. I think anecdotally, we use whole blood. We have limited access. We have 4 units immediately available. We have uncross-matched FFP and blood immediately available. We even have uncross-matched platelets immediately available in our trauma resuscitation unit. So again, we have access to all these things, and we do have criteria for whole blood. But our problem is if it's the day after a major resuscitation, there may be no whole blood available. So
I just want to bring on another caveat and direct to OR, like you do. Our OR is literally next to the trauma base. It takes us our average is 12 minutes for penetrating trauma to be inside the OR. So, but one thing that we notice is that we have had a few patients direct to the OR. That means from the lobby straight into the OR. They all died. One of the reasons is that we're not pretty good at the paperwork, getting the type and cross. And you're going to get a notice from the blood bank that you did not sign it correctly, the paperwork. So we always say, just get the type and cross. We'll take care of the rest. That becomes a problem if your team in the OR doesn't know how to get it done on the first run. That's deadly. So we always require that the patient stop at least for a minute or two to get tap and cross before they're shipped into the OR.
Yeah, I saw another question pop up here from Dr. Chang. Again, it's actually for everyone in the group here. How are you managing antiplatelet consumption history when they need emergency surgery in the setting of trauma? Is anyone doing platelet function studies? How are you doing your platelet transfusions, viscoelastic testing, which again, you can do platelet mapping, I know, with the TEG. We don't frequently have access to that in our acute setting. We certainly don't have any of the platelet assays, functional assays, I guess like the Verify Now assay. We don't have access to that, at least in the short term, prior to going to the OR. I can tell you from our own personal experience, if a patient's on some form of antiplatelet therapy, it's 2 6-packs of platelets from the neurosurgeons and go to the OR. Because typically it's a neurosurgery, that's where you really worry about the most. Anybody else doing anything differently or having better luck with other assessments?
I mean, I think that's, that's basically what we do here at WashU. But I think this is actually something close to what like Albert's bringing up, and especially, our ORs are not right next to the trauma bay, but just in terms of how logistically we run these things, and I think we can become a lot more efficient. I think this is one of those areas that we're going to see it is fixing the problem and chasing the platelets directly and saying, okay, how are they working? Let's see what we actually need to replace, not just giving an arbitrary number and going. But I think that whole blood, all of this is where we're going to go next in terms of making us much more efficient and effective, because we're going to start fixing the problems that we're faced with, not just arbitrarily giving stuff.
Is anyone using any form of like viscoelastic, assays for platelet mapping
We
in
try,
the
but
acute setting?
I think we try and run them, and knowing that we're going to be giving 2 packs of platelets and going to the OR, but at least getting an idea about what they show, because then after the fact, we can start to correct things a little bit easier once we get, into the OR and get past that initial thump and, get going. Anyone else have anything to add to that? Anything else? Well, I know we're past time, but it was well worth it. Thank you very much for doing this. And I hate to ask early, but I think this may be a recurring lecture we ask for. So if you're willing in the future to do it again, I think it'd be very well worth it to always be talking about this and keeping us up to date on what's out there in the literature.
Yeah. Same time next year?
That sounds perfect to me.
All right. Well, everybody have a wonderful evening.
All right.
Thank you, Tom.
Howard.
Thank you very, very much. Thank you all for coming, and I'll send out the email for the invite for next month pretty soon. Thank you, guys. Have a good night. Oh, it was wonderful. Let's see.